Good evening, everyone. One of the hardest parts of starting one of these events is stopping your conversation. I always hate doing that because I love the conversation. I love hearing it, love knowing that everybody's just spending that quality time together. Good evening. I am Lori Shepard, the Executive Director with Tucson Jewish Museum and Holocaust Center. And as always, on behalf of myself, our Board of Directors, and the staff of Tucson Jewish Museum and Holocaust Center, I want to thank all of you for taking the time to be with us tonight, whether you are here in person or one of the many, many folks who are watching via live stream. Tonight is our fourth in the Tucson Jewish Museum and Holocaust Center's 2024-2025 Lakin Lecture series on anti-Semitism, and we are so grateful to all of the people who made this possible, who continue to make this possible. This work is simply not happening without our organizational partners at Jewish Philanthropies of Southern Arizona, the team here at the Tucson JCC, and individual partners like Michael and Marcia Zakaria. Of course, every time I open this fabulous series, I get to acknowledge and thank one very special donor whose support and vision have been here since the very beginning. In fact, she and I were just talking on the phone yesterday about when we came together during COVID. We sat outside and we socially distanced with masks on, and we had a conversation about how do we bring people together, which was a funny conversation to have while social distancing. We wanted to bring people together to fight anti-Semitism, and I think we've done a pretty darn good job so far. This individual prefers to work quietly and in the background, and she does most of her community and philanthropic work in the name of her parents. That is why she established the Edwin and Alma Lakin Education Fund at the Jewish Community at the Jewish Community Foundation of Southern Arizona. She established it to honor her parents, Alma and Eddie, and their lifelong commitment to Holocaust education, the people of Israel, and to their work of combating anti-Semitism. This annual series has been an amazing way to honor the Lakin's legacy. And just as Ed and Alma did in their own lives through advocacy and social justice work, this series helps us tackle the tough topics and to look for the right answers, even when those answers are not necessarily the most convenient or the easiest. To recap this year so far, we have explored anti-Semitism and the threats to our democracy with Rabbi Jonah Pesner. We tackled anti-Semitism on campus with Professor Jacques Berliner-Blau. And most recently, we talked with Amy Splatonik about the importance of community building in fighting anti-Semitism. Tonight, the culmination of this season's four-part series, Antisemitism and Race. Tonight, we are asking questions that feel more urgent than ever. What if the future of our democracy in America depends on the strength of the Black-Jewish alliance? And what if the future begins not in D.C., not in New York City, but right here in Southern Arizona, in our community? We are honored to be able to welcome two extraordinary speakers to guide us through this moment. Our guests aren't just experts, they're architects of a better future. Eric K. Ward is one of the most respected civil rights strategists in the country. He's the Executive Vice President of Race Forward and a nationally recognized voice on white nationalism, anti-Semitism, and multiracial democracy. His insights don't just explain this moment, they are going to lead us through it. Nadine Epstein is the editor-in-chief and CEO of Moment magazine. She is a fearless journalist, public intellectual, and a connector. Her work spans politics, poetry, history, and healing. And she's quietly built some of the most important bridges in Jewish and interfaith spaces over the last 2 decades. Ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome Eric and Nadine.
Hello.
Hi, Nadine. How are you? We're competing, apparently, against the University of Arizona and Duke, but we're going to try for an upset today in the room. It's great to see you in person. How are you doing?
I am good. We do a lot of programs together, and we do a lot of those programs virtually on something we call the Wide River Project. And the Wide River Project, well, I don't know, when did we met, like, what, 3 or 4 years
I was just
ago?
looking, it's a little bit over our 4-year anniversary
Oh my gosh.
since we first did a program together through Moment Magazine, which I hope you get a chance to tell folks about. And then it's just about a week or two. I'm not here. It was just about a week or two, week or two ago, 3 years ago, that we started the Wide River Project.
Yes, and the idea was and we called it the Wide River Project because the relationship between blacks and Jews, in my mind, is like a river. It's a wide river with all these different currents. Some of them are arts, some of them are history, some of them are civil rights, some of them are music. There are so much, and we only tend to know a couple of them, and then usually it's the ones that went bad, or at least we heard it went bad. And so there's so much complexity to the Black-Jewish relationship, and so we started diving deeply into understanding it, because one of the things that I know I'm doing right now in this very polarized time is leaning into complexity, because there just ain't no simple narratives.
There are none, and we started at a very interesting time. There were big shifts happening. We were in a moment, in a rise of hate violence, including anti-Semitic violence. We were in a time where the conversation was the fracturing of the Black-Jewish alliance. Lots of oversimplification, you and I thought. And we saw an opportunity, a chance to not only talk about the problems, but to set those problems and the opportunities in context. And we have had some pretty interesting conversations. I don't know if folks follow Wide River, the program. And I think tonight we're going to get into some of this. So what folks in the audience don't know is this is the first time Nadine and I are on a stage in front of a live audience. So typically we get anywhere from 250 to 500 people who join our online webinars and conversations. But this is the first live audience. And so we were nice enough to ask Lori really nicely if we could do a few things tonight. The first was to have a conversation, because Nadine and I have these conversations. 2, we wanted to hear from local voices who will be joining us a little bit later, because it's great to hear from us, but what does that mean when we leave? Let's continue the conversation where it belongs, in community. And so we're going to talk about a few things tonight. We're going to make some bad jokes. We're going to be serious.
He's going to make the bad jokes.
I will make the bad jokes. Nadine's actually funny. And we're going to stay engaged around a conversation that all of us are attempting to build a little bit of muscles on.
And I just want to say that I lived in Tucson, so I'm so happy to be here. And I lived in Nogales. I covered the U.S.-Mexico border, so for me this is like a homecoming. And so it's just wonderful.
And I haven't been to Tucson in 20 years, 2 decades. I don't even think I'm that old. And I'm glad to be back. And you all gave me like this 90-degree weather. It's going to be really hard to get me on a plane out to the cold north after this. So if you see me wandering around for the next couple of weeks, you know why.
I just want to also show you a picture of, I brought a moment, and the reason I brought this moment with me is because we actually did a wonderful story on Eric. And it's Eric K. Ward on the intersection of hatreds, which is a really good topic for part of what we're talking about tonight. And there's magazines out there that I donated so that you can all read it. And if not, you can go online at momentmag.com and kind of dig deep into Eric's background.
Let's jump in a little bit. Here we are, Nadine. We live in a society right now that seems to celebrate silos, celebrate trench warfare, polarization, finding reasons that we to argue about why we aren't in community together. And it's a hard time. Lots of different pressure points, lots of truths, lots of pain, lots of anger. The emotive level is really high. Yet the two of us, and we're not alone, represent a portion of the American population, Jewish, non-Jewish, black, white, Asian, Native, women, men, straight, you name it, Christian, Muslim, who actually are pushing back against those silos. And I'm curious to hear a little bit more about your personal journey. What are the lessons in your personal journey that got you here to this conversation around anti-Semitism and racism?
Well, we're going to talk more about polarization in this era tonight, because that's we got to talk about that. But I want to talk about why I'm here is because of my mom. When my mom was, and my mom had a story. She's not with us anymore, but she was a teacher in a small Pennsylvania town, and she taught elocution. And she was this young Jewish woman, and she had an African-American student, and this was in the 40s. And he was an amazing speaker. And she worked with him. She was his coach, and he won the school elocution contest, and then he won the county one, and then the state one, and then my mom put him on a train, went with him to Denver, and they entered the nationals. And this was like, my mom used to tell me this story about this young man and how amazing he was and what a speaker he was and how proud she was and what a eye-opening experience it was for her. And I kind of drank it up, and I realized, thinking about it, how that really got me to where I am today, just that story. And I know, like, when I lived in a little town in New Jersey. When I was 4 and 5 years old, I was playing with all the African-American kids. I had play dates at their house. I realize now that I was the only white kid, period, having play dates. And this is just because I happen to have this amazing mom who, by the way, became the executive director of the Jewish Community Center and who just really cared about this topic. And I also just want to say that I have a son, and he is 32 years old, and I have a 2-year-old granddaughter. And my 2-year-old granddaughter, I see this story getting passed on from what I've done in my life. He's adopted a prisoner who is in San Quentin, and they go visit this prisoner who's been there since he's been 17, and he's in his 70s now. And my granddaughter calls this Martin Walker, Shaka Martin Walker, her grandfather. And he's taken on this. My son has taken this man's cause on, and has been working with him and helping him for years. And I feel like I just want to say that it's the stories that what we do in our life that really is helped send the message to the next generation. And I want to tell one more thing, because I forgot. I always had children's seders in Washington, D.C. when my son was young. And often my son and I were the only Jews at the seder, and we had all sorts of people come. And we adopted Mr. Bronston, who was an African-American man who actually had become homeless, and he had come to live with us, and he became part of our family. And he would always sit at the front of the table, and he would tell us stories about what it was like to grow up as an African-American man in Washington, D.C., when Washington, D.C. was a city that was, it was not the city it is today, although I'm not sure, I can't say about what's happening this moment, but it was a city where there was so much discrimination, and what it was like to have that in his life and all the choices that he had made, and it was so meaningful. So I just want to say, my son took those messages, and I'm so proud of what he's doing now. So that's how I got to what I'm doing today, and I feel like it's an important message.
I love that, this idea of the stories and the messages we pass on uh, really do have meaning. I think about that in terms of remembering the Holocaust, right? Never forget. I think about it in terms of the arguments happening in society right now about historical memory. Do we only remember things when they're comfortable versus uncomfortable? What does memory think about? Uh, uh, how do we think about memory and history? I used to tell this story. Folks used to ask me the first question, Eric, are you Jewish? Answer is no, right? The second question was, how did you come to care about anti-Semitism? And I often used to frame it as a little bit of a transactional story, right? And for those who don't know this story, I'm gonna try to tell it in a quick way. I grew up Baptist, so we know how that's going to turn out. But I'm going to try. So I used to tell this story. So I was born in a world where this society was still arguing over whether I should legally be considered a full human being or not, right? I'm that old. If you're shocked, thank you so much for the compliment. But that's the world I was born in. And so I came of age in the public school system at a defining time, right, in my teenage years, at the moment that public school was being desegregated. And that meant being sent across town. So this is the story I tell folks. I was sent across town. I would get off of a city bus with other Black and Latino kids in Southern California, and we would walk 6 blocks to the junior high school. And pretty regularly on that walk to and from the city bus stop, people would drive by in their cars and shout out the N-word to us, scream at us, rev their engines. And these were not other kids, right? These were adults. Now remember, we were 7th, 8th, and 9th graders walking to and from school. That was my first experience with desegregation. I also tell another story. I am the product of punk rock in America. You're welcome. Meaning, those of us in that junior high school, in that desegregated situation, were never going to build bonds across lines of race. It was actually a line of separation and division in our society. But for a quick moment, this thing appeared, punk rock, hip hop. We didn't really know the difference. We just knew it wasn't Lionel Richie. It wasn't Captain and Tennille, no offense, right? But it was music that spoke to our generation. And for a moment in Southern California, for a brief moment, like a 4 or 5 year period, for some of us, not all of us, that became an identity that was more important than anything else that might have divided us. We didn't care what someone's gender was or the religion or their race or where they lived. What we cared about was, what bands did you listen to, right? What buttons were you wearing? What did you get a chance to sneak out of your house or not? And did you get caught, right? That became our identity, and it competed against our racial identity. So if you read the story, you'll learn a little bit more. So what happens, Nadine, in terms of this is, for a moment, there's also reaction to the punk rock scene. Why? It's actually one of the most multiracial spaces on the West Coast for a brief moment. That's how segregated society was. And that multiracial movement, made up of kids, not all of us functional, right, came under a severe backlash. And some of that was by folks who were organized racist. And these folks would put up flyers all the time. Eventually, I moved up to the Pacific Northwest. And they would put flyers up that were anti-black, anti-immigrant, anti-Muslim, and tell the story. But there was always something in it. that referenced the Jewish community. And we were kids under physical threat, and we were trying to build a response. Where were we going to go? Punk rock was our home. Folks say, well, couldn't you have left? Left to what? It was our identity. And so we wanted to fight for it, and we knew we had to build a broad coalition. And we were looking at all the imagery on these flyers, and we were like, if you were being attacked, we wanted to make a relationship with you because we needed those communities. So my relationship, I often said, to learning about anti-Semitism was because I was trying to just understand why were they so fixated on Jews? And we're going to get to that a little bit. So that's what I thought the story was. Mm-hmm. But then something interesting happens. I start to talk to my dad, who's now 99 and a half. You've hung out with him.
So I've interviewed his dad.
And what do we find out? It's not as transactional. The stories and the memories actually come into play. Talk a little bit about this.
Talking to his dad is like was talking to my mom. I mean, really, he lived in a very multiracial world, and and you've inherited so much of him. I felt like I was talking to you on some level. Except
he's more charming.
He's more old school. Yeah. He's kind of a gentlemanly kind of style. Yeah. But he was I felt this automatic connection with him. And so I know you tell this story, but I think it's much deeper how you got to where you are. I mean, I had the same stories in high school. Like I went to high school right after a riot in Asbury Park, New Jersey, in the black part of town. And it was a scary time. Like I was going to high school there. As it turns out, like my buddies were all the African American students, and I just went to a reunion, and I realized it was the African American kids who held the school together. They were the leaders of our class, and it was amazing. And so I had this. So again, it was like incredible. I look back, and it was this incredibly positive relationship. So we've had these very positive experiences, which I think lead us to be on the stage.
They lead us to be on the stage. They lead people to be leaders, and they inspire us in the hard moments. And we're in a hard moment right now. We're in a moment where literally before our eyes, I often say this, we watch the events of October 7th. That has become not a starting line, right? It is a measure. The Black civil rights movement in this country doesn't kick off with the arrest of Rosa Parks. It is a historical marker of the civil rights movement. This moment, this reckoning, this conversation around anti-Semitism doesn't start on October 7th, but it is a marker. And in that marker, Nadine, I often talk about we have watched some horrifying things happen. Not just outside of this country, the taking of hostages, right, what is happening in Gaza, the fear, the lack of safety over there, but it has had repercussions here in the United States that are worth repeating. One, record-level hate violence targeting Jewish and Muslim communities. The shattering of the civil rights coalition in this country. I call it broken at this point. Others may dispute that. The third is the shrinking of public and intellectual space. People being fired, people being shunned, not invited or included into social, cultural spaces, families not talking to one another, political violence. All of this has happened in the last year, and I often point out, not by who may be liberal. We like to point to Trump a lot, right? Look at what they're doing. But the truth of that is, most of that has happened under our watch. Those who see themselves as human rights or civil rights activists, right, have set some of the stage from that. Talk a little bit about the challenges of this moment and what it's meant around the conversation of anti-Semitism and racism from your perspective.
I mean, it's everything. I mean, anti-Semitism is a conspiracy theory. Conspiracy theories grow out of polarized eras. We've never had such a polarized era in this country. And we And it's so incredibly important for us not to be polarized. If I'm doing anything right now, and I'm doing this at the moment, is I'm trying to recreate a new center. And we are also together trying to create, like this, we did a program right after the election, which was called The Center is Radical. The center is a radical place to be. We are all so accustomed to living in our bubbles. And at moment, and just because I'm a human being, and I'm so curious about the world, I talk to so many people, and I try not to be in any bubbles. I'm trying to understand. I want to know what people are really thinking. And when we get to actually talking, not on social media and AI, they interact with our brains in a way. But when we actually talk in person, when we touch each other, when we look at each other's eyes, when we have a conversation, and when we don't even agree with each other, we find nuance. And from nuance comes a little place, some space. I call it, I've actually been thinking a lot about diplomacy recently, because we're in a new era of diplomacy, and but diplomacy allows you to have some space. We don't have to say every single thing exactly as as it comes out. You have to leave a little space for agreement to grow, for trust to grow, and agreement to grow. I often quote George Shultz, who was, and he talked about how trust is the coin of the realm, and it's so important if we're not together. I give this example I did a book with Justice Ginsburg before she died, and one of her closest friends in the world was Anthony Scalia. Now, these were two people who had absolutely nothing in common in terms of legal jurisprudence. And I'm not sure they ever changed each other's minds. But they connected on this very human level and had a very human relationship, which did change the tenor of conversations in the Supreme Court, in private deliberations, which was something that was very important to Justice Ginsburg. And I think it's just, again, I want to say how important it is that, I don't unfriend people. And I go out of my way to talk to people who I disagree with. I don't even need to tell them what I think. I want to know what they think. And then after a while, trust does build. There's one person once a year I talk to. He is very, very conservative. And we'll talk for 3 hours once a year. And probably by the 2 hours and 45 minutes into the conversation, we find that we actually have a number of points that we agree on. And so I just want to say how important that is.
I love that. We have had those kinds of conversations.
We have. Not always in the same language. We don't use the exact same words.
No.
Like he uses the word fascism, and I never use the word fascism. I would say authoritarianism or strongman. And I have to always, sometimes we have to negotiate this language.
That's right.
But what we're trying to say is often very similar.
And we've had wild conversations, right? We've had conversations with skinheads.
Yes.
We have had conversations with folks who...
Black Hebrew Israelites.
Black Hebrew Israelites. And we have had conversations with folks we see as conservative, folks we see as liberal. And in those conversations, we have found nuances that would surprise people in the audience. So, for one, right, you've heard of skinheads. Think about what you see, right? What did we learn in the conversation on that issue?
We learned that skinheads actually, one of the kind of origins of skinheads was Jews in England. And that was incredible. And we also learned that, so many people think of skinheads as being right-wing and being neo-Nazis. And that was really, as Eric can tell you about this, they were usurpers. They usurped a movement that, in Eric's vision, was, a kind of a beautiful movement where kids came together. And this happens to so many movements. And we've kind of have resurrected the skinhead movement for history.
Jewish kids who were fascinated by Black Caribbean culture, right? Go watch the episode. If you don't have to believe it up here. But this is what happens when we step out of our silos. Our worlds become super complicated. And one of the things we're facing right now is an attempt to kind of, I feel like, to oversimplify things, to flatten them into these old bad B movies, right? With the good guys on one side, and then the other side must be the bad guys, right? And we are always the good guys, and the other folks are always the bad guys. And I think it's that kind of thinking that has allowed anti-Semitism to take root, right, across the political spectrum. I often tell folks there isn't really a right or left anti-Semitism. There's merely just anti-Semitism in a society and how different political and cultural and social formations tap into it. And I think about it in this way because the conspiracy of anti-Semitism, right? We tend to think of anti-Semitism as the acts of an individual, right? Or an aberration, a hate crime. But it's actually a worldview, and a worldview that all of us, I would argue, non-Jewish and Jewish, are susceptible to.
But
it's an old narrative,
But
right?
it's a worldview that I think lived on the fringes for quite a few years, in the United States at least. In 2012, we did a big project at Moment looking at anti-Semitism and really came away with the conclusion that anti-Semitism had become a serious problem in Europe, but it hadn't yet really crept into the United States, and I would say 2016 we saw that really changed. But it's really, but you know, there was anti-Semitism on the left, and there was anti-Semitism on the right. They're not manifested the same ways. One thing that makes today so very different, though, is that these two rivers, and I keep going back to the analogy of rivers, but these two rivers of anti-Semitism have come together, and they're flowing together. And I feel like that actually makes everyone more vulnerable. It makes Jews more vulnerable. It makes America more vulnerable. It makes democracy more vulnerable. It makes the Black-Jewish relationship more vulnerable. And
What's that question you want to ask me, Nadine? You're looking at me like you want to ask me something.
well, I think one question that we should talk about is why anti-Semitism should be understood as racism. I feel like you should give us a little talking to on that.
Yeah. So first we have to talk about anti-Jewish hatred, right? Or what some folks call Jew hatred. So because anti-Semitism is actually a more recent evolution of anti-Jewish hatred. See, I'm going to bring a little nuance. But stay with me for a second. Anti-Jewish hatred is one of the oldest forms of bigotry in the world, only outdated by what? Misogyny. Right? Outside of the systemic and continuous hatred and discrimination against women, right? Anti-Jewish bigotry is the oldest consistent form of bigotry. Why is that? Because it's effective, right? Why do we tell stories over and over again in new ways? If anyone's seen Hadestown, right? It's because those stories are effective. And the hatred of Jews, for lots of reasons, right, that others have talked about on this stage, right, has been an effective form of bigotry. Now, there have been different types of hatred towards Jews. A religious form of prejudice, right? Cultural forms of prejudice against Jews, right? Anti-Semitism is a specific form. And it places Jews not as just a religious or cultural other, but as a racialized other. And it's an idea that, again, doesn't start at one time. We can go all the way back to the 1600s and begin to see the emergence of the racialization of Jews. But where it really takes form is in the late 1800s, early 1900s in Europe during the period of Enlightenment. And the reason it takes form is twofold. One is bad science called white supremacy or racial eugenics starts to take root in Europe. The second is that there is a challenge to royalty in Europe. People who had been feudal slaves, right? Those who were living in poverty in Western Europe thought to themselves, this doesn't feel right, and began to try to demand change or this thing we know as democracy. Now, if you were royalty, you might have perceived that as a threat. And what they needed was a buffer. Something to put between the haves and the have-nots in society, where the have-nots could take out their frustrations and anger. This is the racialization of Jews. Remember, most anti-Semitism doesn't function by targeting Jews as a racial other, but as a,
But it used to. It used
as
to.
a religious other.
It used to,
absolutely.
yeah.
Greece, right? We can look through history.
And you can look at
But
Linnaeus. Linnaeus actually
Linnaeus.
does, he and other people at that time start categorizing the different races. But then also during the Inquisition, Jews are actually, the whole concept of blood, a lot of this ended up inspiring racism towards
That's right.
blacks in Africa.
The
It became
development
very
of
useful.
white supremacy actually begins in the Iberian Peninsula
Absolutely.
by the targeting of Jews.
Yes. But there was already, Jews there were many tragedies before that. But that is where we really start with this.
Talk about the protocols, because the protocols become a powerful narrative in the development of modern anti-Semitism.
I mean, you talk a lot about the protocols.
Yeah.
Maybe you should tell us about the protocols. I mean,
Yeah.
I mean, they obviously are hugely important, and they're still, you can buy them today. You can find them online. The kinds of information in the protocols are things that we're still talking about. It's the same conspiracy theories, and for me, they all have the same core, which is control. Whether it's Jews have control of the media, Jews have control of this, Jews have control of the banks, that is really the core there. But you have some thoughts on this. You talk about these a
Now I'm going
lot.
to come up with some. I was actually just
You don't
like,
have to. I got
that was
other
a
things
great
for you to
answer.
talk about. Yeah.
What I would add is, again, remember the power of narrative and how it sticks with us. I think of a story once. I have a really good friend of mine. She's a mentor who's older than me. And one time, her, myself, and her young daughter at the time, who I think was like 3 or 4 years old, were at an event in support of Native American religious rights. And in the midst of that, her 3-year-old daughter started yanking on her mom's coat, saying, "Mom, Mom," really loud, right, in a very quiet space. So whatever was coming was not going to be good, right? But she kept saying, her mom was trying to quiet her, and she kept saying, "Mom, Mom, Mom." And so finally, my friend says to her daughter, "Yes, what?" And her daughter says, "Are these Indians?" And her mom says yes and is trying to and the next thing her daughter says is, "Indians are bad." Now, she would have never learned that from her mom, right? Her mom was appalled. And I watched her mom say, "Yeah, but you know so-and-so, right?" And her daughter said yes. And she said, "Well, she's Native American." So she started going down a list, and then she said, "We'll talk about this later." I talked to my friend 2 days later, and she had gotten a chance to talk to her daughter. And it turned out her daughter had gotten this idea from an old Popeye cartoon she had seen earlier that week. Popeye was was being chased around by a caricature of a native man with a headdress and a hatchet. Her daughter had walked away from watching that show thinking Native Americans were bad. Now imagine if she hadn't been in a space where that question had come up. She could have long forgotten about ever seeing the cartoon and still holding on to the emotive experience, right? Seeding a stereotype with very real repercussions. That is the power of the protocols of the learned elders of Zion. It actually shows up in lots of ways in pop culture that we don't even recognize, including the creators. I often talk about Chris Carter. Anyone know the X-Files? Anyone raise your hand if you've ever heard of the X-Files. Okay, thank you for not leaving me alone out there. Okay, please don't walk out here saying Eric Ward said Chris Carter is an anti-Semite. That's not the point of this. X-Files. What is the story of the X-Files? 2 FBI agents uncover a global alien conspiracy to control humanity by infecting humanity with an alien virus. They seek to do this by building a conspiracy between the aliens and the elites in society to take over the financial system, the cultural system, the political system. I often tell folks, you don't actually have to read the protocols of the elders of Zion to understand it. You can nearly watch almost any alien invasion story that has ever been made, and it contains elements of the protocols. Why? Because it became a popular narrative, not just because it was bigoted, but because it was culturally entertaining. That is the power of the protocols, and it plays out over and over again. And when we don't have the space to talk about it, when we don't have the space to understand it, we then function around these stereotypes and fears in ways that impact our society in dangerous ways.
Or people read it at night, late at night on the internet by themselves. And so it is really interesting, like, can we talk about these things? Can we have safe spaces to have a conversation about the protocols and know what's in them? Because I think a lot of people don't even know what's in them. Or a lot of us don't know exactly what's in them, but people find them and take them to heart.
What do you think this means? Let's talk a little bit, really quickly, because I know we need to now move to the next phase. So we've been up here talking a little bit about the things that have brought us to this moment. We have talked a little bit about our understanding of anti-Semitism. What we haven't talked about is how it's shattering the Black Jewish coalition. We've had many conversations around this, Nadine. I want you to talk a little bit about what you think that threat is and why is it important. And then we're going to invite some other voices to bring us up here to talk about what we do about it.
So I know you've been saying recently that the Black-Jewish alliance is broken and shattered, and I actually just don't see it that way. I see that there's this wide river, and there are some currents in that river that we all fixate on, and we fixate on, some generations fixate on 1968 and the SNCC breakup when Jews were, uninvited to be part of it. Some people focus on, Black Lives Matters, kind of connecting, a very small percentage of Black Lives Matter leaders, by the way, connecting with Palestinians. Other people, there's many moments of betrayal that I think a lot of Jews feel. And it's such a bigger relationship, and we have there's so many places in the Black community, there's so many allies. After October 7th, I was watching a play about Abraham Joshua Heschel at JTS and Jewish Theological Seminary in New York. And a woman stood up after the play, there was a talk back, and said, "Oh my God, Abraham Joshua Heschel he would just die. If he was alive today, he would see that all of our allies have deserted us." And I got up and I said, well, actually, that's so not true. There are so many people who are connected to us of all kinds. And if you look at the world in that kind of very, binary way, it's not helping anyone, because there are so many people of whatever our background or our race, or want to work together, want to find consensus. We're horrified by October 7th, and also felt empathy for what happened in Gaza. I mean, and also, by the way, we can feel for more than one thing in our hearts. We can have empathy, and that's usually important too. I just want to add that. I think we forget that. So it's not that it's shattered. There's just so many different currents in it, and we shouldn't focus on the places where it's just shattered. Because remember, polarization is really a tool. It's something that breaks democracy apart. And weakening democracy, people who want to weaken democracy support polarization and help to polarize us. I want to go to Budapest this summer and do a reporting trip. And look at what Viktor Orban has done. You could see what Viktor Orban has just done within the Jewish community. The Jewish community doesn't talk to each other anymore. It's so incredibly fractured. And it's not just the Jewish community. So we really have to kind of fight that image of the Black-Jewish relationship being shattered, because it may be different, it has different currents, it has different streams, but it is not shattered. I know you disagree.
I think it's broken, or I call it broken, because I think we have flattened it and oversimplified it. So we hear folks say, for instance, there were no Jews who were part of the Black Civil Rights Movement. Not true. When you're looking at most of those pictures of black and white together, right, what you're looking at are mostly Black folks, right, Jews, and Italian and Irish Catholics, right? That's who made up, and the number of Jews who were involved was phenomenal, but it wasn't the entire Jewish community. It wasn't even the majority of the Jewish community. Most of the Jewish community was actually nervous. It was actually a brave number of folks who were willing to step up and do something courageous, something uncomfortable. And so too was it on the African American side, right? The majority of the Black community wasn't supportive of this Black-Jewish alliance. So I often say the Black-Jewish alliance is broken because we've come to accept these myths, right, and untruths about who we were that simply aren't true in this moment. For instance, I also point out, right, we forget that there were 3 cornerstone pieces of legislation that come out of the Civil Rights Movement. And this is in response to folks who say, well, we showed up for Black folks. Well, actually, folks showed up for their own self-interest, right? These 3 cornerstone legislation was the Voting Rights Act, right? The Desegregation Act. It wasn't just Black folks who were desegregated or redlined. We don't have Jewish hospitals and social clubs because everything was happy-dory, right? It's because Jews were also being discriminated against in American society. But the third was the National Immigration Act, which ended anti-Semitic practices that stopped folks like the Frank family from fleeing Europe in the midst of the Holocaust. That was won by this Black Civil Rights Coalition. So it's a much more complicated story of courageous leaders, and it was about local leadership. Billionaires did not fund the Montgomery bus boycott, right? It was funded by people who raised money grassroots and came together because they believed in a different possibility for themselves and for their children. It was about local. So I'm going to let you get the last word in, and in the meantime, I'm going to ask our 3 panelists to come join us up here so we can transition.
I just want to point out that we actually agree completely on this. We're just using different language.
All the time.
But I also want to say that Abraham Joshua Heschel, of course, was, everyone's very proud of him now, but at the time he was definitely kind of ran into some professional trouble because of what he was doing. But I also want to just point out that every community has its own. When Eric talks about local, every Jewish community in the United States, every community in the United States has their own Black Jewish history. Like the story of local leaders and people in Washington, D.C. is really fascinating. The story of Chicago, I used to live in Chicago. It's an incredible story what happened in Chicago. In San Francisco and Tucson, every community has its own leaders. And so you can think about how complicated and how wide this river is when you think about all these different, the stories of each city. They are not the same.
Yeah. Every community can make its own history. And the lesson from there is we should not get wrapped up in the national narratives. They do not speak to the individuality and the uniquenesses of what's happening in our communities. Neither do they speak to the possibilities. So to anchor this conversation, Nadine, go ahead.
We will have to talk about the possibilities at the end. We're going to focus on possibilities too.
We're going to focus
Okay.
on possibilities. We've invited 3 distinguished voices, and they each bring something unique. And we're honored to have them on the stage with us. These, as I said before, are not just national questions. They hit right here in Southern Arizona. And to explore that, we're turning to a phenomenal panel of local leaders who live this work every day. And first up, I want to introduce Darrell Parrish-Bakeman, who is a retired nonprofit executive with decades of experience in socioeconomic development, political and organizational fundraising, and public speaking. She founded Worship, It's a Simple Thing, has hosted radio and cable talk shows, and helped elect Chicago's first Black mayor. And Darrell has served on the boards of major organizations and continues to be a civic force in Southern Arizona. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, Eric. I'm delighted to be here, both with you and Nadine.
Thank you
and
so
the other
much.
panelists.
Talk to me about what a Black Jewish Alliance means here in Southern Arizona.
Well, it can mean many things to many people. Probably it's a little different than you might think because in Southern Arizona, Black people are not in one neighborhood or one community. We're spread out throughout the community. So it might look different here than it might in some other places. And because of that, I've lived in the northwest section of Tucson, Arizona. When I first got here 25 years ago, I did not see very many people who were my hue. I would see them in the grocery store, and I would say hi, because there weren't a lot of us. I connected primarily with the African American community through my involvement in social clubs, sororities, social organizations like the Links, and Jack and Jill and things like that because I came here with those experiences. We do have African American churches. I lived northwest and there weren't any up there and I didn't want to come all the way down here to go to church. So there weren't a lot of connecting points. You could join groups. We have their caucuses and organizations like the NAACP that specialize in African American issues, but I'd like to think that the NAACP, as I remember it in the 60s, you can tell by him sharing my resume that I'm a little older than most of the people in this room, or maybe just as old as a few of you. And so I grew up in the 60s marching. I grew up in the 60s and revolting from things that were going on in our society. And I grew up in Hyde Park in Chicago. Are there any people in here who grew up in Chicago in Hyde Park? Yeah, you probably did because that's where Jews and Blacks lived. And my father was a realtor and he converted an apartment building and everybody moved out when they found out that this African American man was going to have this 6-flat building except the Jewish family. And I grew up playing with Ziggy and Linda. They were my friends. And so they were people I grew up with. Even though I went to a school that was parochial and mostly African American, I played with Ziggy and Linda. And I'm saying that because we've been telling stories. I went to college, and when we were protesting, I was standing next to people who were Jewish. The alliance with Jews is in my DNA because the things that I did with people who were Jewish. And because of that, I don't understand a breaking up of something because it exists within me. I mean, I hear the things that other people say, I understand the things that other people say, but for me, it doesn't resonate because I have relationships with people. I understand them. I think they understand me, and more importantly, not understand as much as see me, hear me. I see them, I hear them. And once you grow up with that, it sticks with you. So I think if we could get back to that, we'd be better off. So that's enough said.
That's beautiful. Thank you. Wow. Okay. I want to introduce Hava Leipzig-Holzhauer. And Hava is the president and CEO of Jewish Philanthropies of Southern Arizona. So many of you know her. She's a former civil rights and employment law litigator, and she's led the ADL across Florida, created a Center for Tolerance and Jewish Studies in upstate New York, and helped Jewish communities navigate challenging transitions with strength and clarity. And I wanted to know, what leadership qualities do you think are needed right now, more than anything?
Thank you, Nadine, and thank you, Eric, and thank you, Lori, and thank you, Lynn. And it's wonderful to be here and to be here together. A lot of qualities. I do have high standards for leadership, but I'm going to pick a few to focus on together about the right now per your question. Open-hearted. I think it's incredibly important that our leadership be open-hearted. And I remember when my children were in middle school and high school, and I was invited as the director of the Anti-Defamation League in the state of Florida to come to school and talk about being a CEO for an organization. And there were others who were also talking about being CEOs in other contexts. And I talked about being open-hearted and heart-led leadership. And I remember when I left that one of my friends, who is still my friend, he kind of smiled with me a little bit. And he runs a huge company, lots and lots of dollars, very national across the country. And he was like, really? Really? That's the top priority? That works for you? And I said, it works for me and it should work for you too. Because if we are starting with our hearts in the right place, whatever piece of leadership we're undertaking, whether it be the important substantive work of race and anti-Semitism that we're talking about, operations, HR, all of those pieces, if we start, in the right place, it's really important. Two others really quickly. One, always learning, always studying. Our leadership has to be continuously learning. Open to changing their minds, open to new ideas that they might not have had before, and new information. We need to be future-driven, thinking about our children and our grandchildren and what we're doing for the generations to come, not just riding out our time in the second halves of our careers. And one that's kind of new and very, for the now, for me, is leaning in to targeted, specific relationship building around the hard topics. And I say that because for those of us in the space of diversity, equity, inclusion, all those words, intergroup, interrace conversations for the last couple of decades, one of the primary things we did was we broke bread together. And this still remains something I think that's very, very important, just being together. But what we didn't do often was actually get into direct conversation about things that were important to our different communities. And so we need to take that next step in our relationships and actually do that. And so we don't have the experience that many in our Jewish community felt we had post-October 7th, where a lot of our relationships and allies weren't there with us. And when we sort of in-house went through the questioning period of why, you know, it came out very simply. It's like turning the power off and on when your printer's not working. Like, it's really simple. We actually never had a conversation about Israel with many of our allies, right? We never had the conversation. So I think that's really, really important for leadership right now. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So true.
And I also want to introduce Dr. Cherie Meeks. Dr. Meeks, thank you for joining us. The Assistant Dean for Leadership and Student Development at the University of Arizona's Honor College and the President of the NAACP of Tucson. She's a scholar and a community leader whose work centers on race, gender, and the lived experiences of African American mothers in higher education. You are a critical voice, both in civic spaces and in academic spaces. And I want to ask you, where have our communities shown up for each other? And where have we missed the mark?
Thank you very much. It is a pleasure to be here with you all this evening. Thank you for having me. I feel like I want to start. There's so many things that I want to say, and no one has said this, but I feel like I need to say it. The lights are definitely on. To say that. You know, I kind of want to start with the end with a call to action, and I feel like that is the question for me. We have work to do. There are many gaps. We have not shown up for one another in this community. I think we find opportunities where we have, but they have not been consistent. I think that so many ways we've been short-lived. There may be something that we want to address as a community, and perhaps we come together, and it's for a short period of time, but the longevity of it is not real. And so we're doing something for the moment, something, you know, for just right then, but when we think about how are we going to sustain this, how are we making sure that these are relationships that are real, these are not performative, I think that's where we miss the mark. And having conversations, I feel like I could have stayed right in my seat and just continued to listen, because I feel like I've learned so much because I don't know even what I don't know. And so to be able to hear the stories and to hear the history and learn words that I know, you all were talking about protocol. I can't wait to go home and Google and learn. And I think that is the beginning. You talked about storytelling. If we don't tell our stories, if we don't pass this on, if we don't have community spaces where we're talking about these things, we will never understand one another. And working together will continue to be a challenge because we're moving in different directions. We may start with something in mind, but then we veer off because we are not intending to do the same thing because we haven't taken time to understand one another. So I think that is so important. Things like this, but not a one-time thing. Let's keep this going. Leaders, I think being in spaces where we are encouraging conversations, getting to know one another, reaching out to one another. It doesn't have to be a crisis in the community. Just getting together for, you know, positive reasons or just to relationship build is so important. So serving as the president of NAACP here in Tucson is an honor and a privilege, and it's something that I treat like a job. I take it very seriously. If you are on my executive committee, you know that. But I take it very seriously because I believe that I was called to do this work and that I was called to do it now. I do it in the community, but I also do it professionally. So when I go to work every day, that is this work as well. It is sharing information. It's encouraging people to talk about the tough stuff. To have the uncomfortable conversations, and yes, your voice may shake, you may say the wrong thing, and I think we are fearful of saying the wrong thing, so we say nothing, and where's the learning in that? Where, you know, how can we teach? How can we encourage one another along if we're not willing to make those mistakes, but also to give grace to one another in those spaces? But with NAACP, that was an organization that has been around, test. Anyone? Do you know how long?
Since 1909?
1909, yes. That is, yes, if I had a prize. 116 years. And I would like to think that there would be no need for this organization anymore because the mission is to eliminate discrimination. And it is for all people. Oftentimes folks get caught up in the NAACP and believe that it is just about Black folks, but it is about the elimination of discrimination for all people. Yes, there are times where we prioritize Black folks, but we care about all folks. And I love the history that you shared. The NAACP was started not just by Black folks. It was Jewish, it was Irish.
Lillian Wald and Joel Springarn
Absolutely.
and so many amazing, amazing people.
Yes, so to think about that legacy and to be able to lead in this way, I'm just excited to be here because I'm also thinking about what will I do next? As a leader of an organization that I believe has influence, what am I going to do to make sure that we don't have these gaps and to bring our communities together so that if there is crisis or if we do need to come together, which we always need to come together, that we're not, we're ready to move. Because trust is important. And so if we haven't built that trust first, whatever we do next, it's going to be a little shaky. So if we are building together before we get to that point where we need to move, action. When it's time, let's go. And I think that is incredibly important.
Thank you so much. Well, let's just open this up for a little bit so that we can respond to one another. And maybe just for a minute, because we're running out of time, just to, what's resonating in what you've heard. And we'll start with Hava. We'll just go in order. Is there something that you'd like to add?
What you just said about building the relationships and building the trust so that it's there in the times of crisis. I'm relatively new to this community, so I had to ask some questions before tonight about sort of the state of the relationships of the Jewish and the Black community. And really, in my year and a half, I had seen very little of it firsthand. And so I made a bunch of calls, and historically, we have had strong one-to-one relationships. We've had some ecumenical and clergy relationships. We've been involved together with different committees and groups that came together, sometimes put statements out together, attended each other's seders and MLK Day parades. And that all is incredibly important. It's sort of baseline, but as I mentioned earlier, I think we not only need to do that, but we need to take it, further to another level to be there for each other.
Thank you. Dr. Meeks? You don't have, if you want, we can come back to you. Okay.
Could you ask the question again, please?
I just wanted to give you a minute if there was something, and maybe let's go to Darryl first because you spoke last, so you can have a little more time to think.
Okay.
Is there something that has been said that you just want to respond to for a minute?
I always like to leave with something. Where do we go from here? And I think that we have an opportunity now that we probably didn't realize we had before, and that is this. We are the United States of America, U.S., and I said this to Eric in the car. Our original motto of this country was what? E pluribus unum. And some people thought it would be a good idea to change it to In God We Trust. In pluribus unum, we're all together, we are one. And I think we need to remember that we do nothing by ourselves. We only do things collectively when we are standing side by side, marching, talking, conversing. We have to do more things together. And we have a wonderful stimuli, and it's called the Trump regime. And whenever we have that, and we have to see it as that, not as a negative. It's an opportunity for us to do things and be together. When we do things together, we talk, we see each other, we engage each other, we eat together. And from that, we will be able to solve more problems than we could have ever thought. It's a lot simpler than we ever make it.
Absolutely. Thank you. Dr. Meeks, you want to add something?
I sure can.
Okay.
So perhaps it's the educator in me, but I just, want to reiterate how important I think it is that we learn history. I heard someone say once, and I keep saying this like it is an original, so that's why I have to keep saying I heard someone else say, that history leaves clues. So the history will tell us what we might anticipate for the future. So if we don't know our history, if we aren't paying attention, if we aren't passing information down, when these things happen next, we don't understand it. The context isn't there. So I think it's just so important for us to come together and not just to learn my own history, but to learn your history, to share history with so many other people and make that a priority. I had an opportunity a couple of weeks ago to take a group of students to Montgomery, Alabama. So I love that you kept referring to Montgomery and the bus boycott, but to visit the Equal Justice Initiative and the legacy sites and the history. When I just think about history, I'm like, dang, why don't we come together? Why don't we work together? Because I know that our history is troublesome. And if we don't reckon with that, if we don't acknowledge that, our future will be the same. And so it's just so important to me that we learn. And of course, there are challenges on what we can learn, how we can learn, how much of it, from whose perspective. So again, I see this as an opportunity, perhaps a call to action, something for us to be thinking about. How do we educate our communities about our history if we are not certain that schools will do that, or that, this will happen in other ways? So I just think that's so important.
Thank you.
Okay, so I get to ask one light question to each of you. So I'm going to give you like 30 seconds to sit with it. If you could give one word each to this audience for them to hold for the next 3 days, to say in the mirror, to reflect on before they go to sleep, to try to insert it into a sentence, if you're a songwriter, to put it, just if you were to each give them one word that they commit to holding for the next 3 days, tell the audience the word and then quickly tell them why.
That's a hard question.
They said my word, us, U.S. It's us. It's not you, it's not me, it's us.
Us.
I'll say resilience. We are resilient, you are resilient, I am resilient, and with resilience is a second word, but it's what I think permeates resilience, which is hope. Hope.
And I will say connection, and I say that because I think we can make connections with our communities, we can make connections across communities, and that's how we're going to be the us that we know we are, and we can trust that we have hope and resilience and can lean on one another.
So for the next 72 hours, I want everyone in the audience to argue, to make jokes, hold, reflect, dream about 3 words: us, hope, and connection. And I want you to thank our panel for joining us. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you for being leaders and courageous in this community. So, we now have something for the audience to do really quickly. I want you to turn to someone near you. We're going to give you about 3 minutes. And I want you each to share what stood out most tonight, What's one thing you want to do differently? Actually, it was just two things. So take 3 minutes, turn to someone next to you. What stood out most tonight? What's one thing you want to do differently?
And maybe somebody you don't know, if possible.
If possible.
We should do.
In our final
Closing reflections, yeah. Okay.
kind of want to bring people back, but the buzz out there
It's
is
a lovely
real.
buzz.
I'm going to let the person who's finishing right now kind of finish what you're saying right now, put a period on that or a comma, or if you're like me, a semicolon. And yeah, I love this. You know what? I know that's right. That's why I said it's like the comma or semicolon going on out there. Let me do this. Let us hear from I want to hear from two people. I'm looking, can I just call someone out? I see someone in an amazing lime shirt out there. At least it looks like under the lights. Over here in the corner. I love that shirt. Yeah, you're looking behind you like, please don't call on me. And I'm absolutely calling on you. Mainly I have shirt envy, but I also want to hear, tell us your two things. Or tell the other person's two things.
Let me hear the question again. I'm trying to figure out how I'm going to get rid of this shirt tonight.
What stood out most tonight, and what's one thing you want to do differently?
I think the stories from the three young ladies, local, really stood out to me. I'm not saying what Eric and Nadine said didn't, but I really enjoyed the local emphasis. What do I want to do? I guess think about us, hope. I forgot what the third word was. But connection, thank you. And see how I can make that useful in the next, not only 72 hours, but maybe ongoing. Because I think those are three words that really hold a lot of meaning.
Thank you. Thank you for being brave. Do not trade that shirt.
about a woman sitting right in the middle, right here in the middle in the front? Because I can see you, almost. That's what happens when you sit in the front row.
What stood out for me was your story about the punk rocks, because I can totally relate to that. And music is super important. Music is super important to me, as well as in my work. It connects people, and while I may or may not be of your era, I understand how, it's so loud. It took me back to being at university and being a punk rocker. And my brain just, why? Why did I I left the soft preppy life from high school. I left my Weegians behind. And I went straight into shaving not unlike I am right now, shaving my hair. And I couldn't believe, for the first time, there were blacks and there were whites and there were people I had never seen before. And I became pretty. And I didn't ever feel pretty. So your story really resonated for me. And instead of going into trauma, which is where I usually would go, I was like, wow, okay, somebody gets me. And he's right here. And then what was the three?
Hope. Oh, sorry.
Resilience,
Us.
connection, and us.
That's
What was the question around that?
What's one thing you want to do differently?
I really, I want to lean harder into, I'm building communities. And which is kind of strange because I've always thought of myself as one, not an us. And my new profession has taken me into understanding how important community is. So, us, it's got to be about us. And something that I became present to, and then I'll give this up, or I like this. Is that I am a bridge. I'm a bridge in my work. I'm a bridge in my awakening, and I'm a bridge. And I was saying this as I came here because I'm a Latina. I am an African American, and I am also a Jew. So I don't know why I've never thought about it before, because I just am. But I have a bigger responsibility to bring us together.
Wow, thank you.
Thank you.
So why don't you've been thinking about things, and do you have some final reflections, Eric?
You know I have something to say, Nadine. And then we're going to give it up. So we're running just about 20 minutes behind. Bear with us. But we are at the closing moment. What comes to mind for me, Nadine, panel, audience, thank you for your bravery. I see you. I want to say this. Let us hold right now. If you're feeling like, wow, there's so much more I want to say, there's so much more I want to hear, that's the curiosity sparking inside of you. And curiosity is courage. If this part was actually easy, folks say, well, this is the easy thing. If it was that easy, we'd be past it by now. It's the actual hard work, and we do need to lean into it. So that's one thing that comes to mind. The second piece is you cannot teach heart surgery in 90 minutes. If you came here today thinking we were going to solve this, in 90 minutes. That's not fair. If you walked out of here with more questions than we did our job tonight, you have leaders sitting right next to you. Leaders up here, continue this conversation, lean into the courageous stuff. If that doesn't do it, I'm always ending with this. We talk about this in the interview with Moment Magazine. I actually don't know if it made it in there, but we talked about it. I grew up in Los Angeles. I grew up working poor and a latchkey kid. And during the summer, right, most of my friends, you could find us sitting outside. There wasn't a lot of resources outside the apartment building. And so we used to play this game. We'd circle up on the sidewalk and play a game called If I Were. And If I Were went like this, one person at a time. If I were in the zoo and the tiger got out of the cage, here's what I would do. And then we'd argue about what we would do and if it would work or not and how to get out of that. The next person would say, if I were driving down the freeway and the brakes went out, here's what I would do. The answer was always pull the emergency brake. Do not do that. But we would argue about what would work. The question that would come up every summer was, if I were in the midst of the 1960s civil rights movement, here's what I would do. And boy, were we full of bravado about what we would and wouldn't do, what we would put up with, what we wouldn't. We didn't understand the choiceless choices of our parents and grandparents. In short, we were very full of it about what we would and wouldn't do. That question haunted me for decades. How would I have shown up? Then about 10 years ago, I realized I no longer had to ask myself that question. And I'm here to tell everyone in the audience, if you have ever pondered that or another historical moment, you no longer have to wonder as well. The truth is however you would have shown up in the 1960 civil rights movement is going to be exactly how you show up when you walk out of these doors tonight. Do not let history pass you by. Do not miss out on the chance to pass down one of the most important stories to your children, your grandchildren, and your great-grandchildren. This is not just about now. It is about the society that we say that we want to be. And I'm here to tell you, we do not get to that society, the non-Jew, unless we tackle anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is not just a threat to the Jewish community. It is a threat to 75 years of black civil rights struggle in this country. It is a threat to democracy. It is a threat to the promise that a bunch of different communities do not need kings or dictators or royalty to tell us how we can make a society work. Anti-Semitism makes us lazy. Anti-Semitism oversimplifies. And if we want to crack the code to a healthy democracy, we have to be humble enough to understand hate groups do not bring anti-Semitism into our communities. They merely tap into the anti-Semitism that already exists. But we do not get to the answer on anti-Semitism if we're not humble enough to have the space to build the muscles. We do not get to the question of anti-Semitism if we treat every stumble around anti-Semitism as if it's coming out of the mouth of David Duke or Louis Farrakhan. This is not a time for emotion. This is a time for serious leadership. I am not here to move all the Jewish community. I'm not here to try to move all the black community. But what I am looking for are the leaders in both of those communities who know that there is a better life for all of our communities, Jewish and non-Jewish, and that we do not get there unless we go over that mountaintop together. Hold that. Figure out what your moment in history is going to look like. Answer the question, when you walk out this door, how will you show up?
I just want to add one more thing about a couple things that you can do when you walk out the door. One of the things I've been doing recently is reading a lot of biographies, and I read Walter Isaacson's Ben Franklin biography, which if you haven't read it, it's wonderful and it's very comforting at this time. But we need to have this conversation in person and not just on social media. And one of the things that he did that was so wonderful in his lifetime is create a junto group, which was a group of 12 people who came together and discussed ideas in person. And that's how we got juries, by the way, 12 people. And it was remarkable. And I feel like we need to really put ourselves in places where we can be having conversations. And one of those places which we can do, all of us here, is Passover is coming up. And we have Seders. And what a wonderful place and time for us to invite people, other people, interfaith people, friends, people, even acquaintances, to come and join us on a Seder. Because a Seder is a time where we can learn about history and we can also talk about what's happening now. And I just want to put it in your heart to invite people to your Seder this year who you might not normally invite. And even people who disagree with you, and have them there and break matzah with them this year.
Well, good evening, everyone. My name is Lynn Davis. I'm director of the Rabbi Joseph H. Gumbiner Community Action Project at the Tucson Jewish Museum and Holocaust Center. And this is where the museum's, the fourth pillar of the museum's mission lives, that of working with Tucson's diverse community to advance civil rights and human rights. And I've spent the last half hour thinking, oh, they're teeing me up just perfectly for all the things that I'm going to say, and then they hit it out of the park. So may I have one more round of applause, please, for Nadine and Eric and our esteemed guests. The themes that really emerged for me this evening, as I'm sure they were for you, were those of relationships and stories. And in the community relations sphere, we say two very important things about relationships. One is that relationships only happen in proximity. And the other is that relationships can't be built in a time of crisis, right? And that came up this evening as well. Relationships are a process and they're work, and they require proximity and humility and curiosity and a lot of the things that we talked about this evening. And if you are interested in continuing those conversations and building some of those muscles and doing some of that work, we have an opportunity for you. It's 72 hours from now, so that works out really well too. Yeah, it's perfect. It's almost as if you planned that. This Sunday evening, we will have the second in our Courageous Conversations series, and the theme will be stereotypes. And we will break bread. We will have dinner with one another. We will be in proximity. We will meet new friends. We will engage with old friends, and we will have a chance to build some listening muscles, build some empathy muscles, and our hope is, like Eric said, that you walk out with more questions maybe than answers, but that you also walk out feeling heard. So there are a few spots left for this weekend, and then there will be more. This is part of an ongoing program. I believe we have a one-page flyer out front that has the QR code. You can also register via our website or come ask any one of us and we'll point you in the right direction. But thank you all so very much for being here this evening. Thank you to the Tucson J, to Jewish Philanthropies of Southern Arizona, to our very generous donor and sponsor for making this opportunity possible, and thank you all so much for being here.